For 400 years, visitors to Dragsholm Castle in Denmark viewed a mummified corpse displayed in a glass cabinet. Most onlookers never realized that this public exhibition was once one of the most powerful men in Europe. This was James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell, and the infamous third husband of Mary, Queen of Scots. The year 1567 was a dark milestone, marking the most shocking royal scandal in Europe. Bothwell orchestrated the gunpowder assassination of the king consort Lord Darnley before kidnapping Queen Mary to force a royal marriage. Instead of securing the crown, these ruthless actions provoked a national rebellion that ultimately condemned him to a decade of madness chained in a Danish dungeon. James Hepburn was born into a powerful Scottish noble family around 1534. He inherited his father's title, the Earl of Bothwell, in 1556 while in his early 20s. This earldom granted him significant official positions, including Lord High Admiral and Warden of the Marches. However, his actual authority relied entirely on the number of armed soldiers he could personally command. Bothwell spent his youth in the lawless border region between Scotland and England. Central governments had very little control over this rough and violent frontier zone. Local families survived by launching nighttime raids to steal livestock and goods from their neighbors. In this chaotic environment, a leader's power depended on military force rather than formal laws or courts. Growing up in this harsh system taught Bothwell to rely on direct action. He built and commanded a private army of loyal men drawn from local border families. He actively participated in the violent routines of the region, using force to protect his lands. He quickly learned that armed soldiers solved problems much faster than distant royal courts or written treaties. These border habits deeply influenced how Bothwell interacted with everyone else in his life. He viewed other people purely as resources to exploit or as obstacles to eliminate. Whenever individuals served his immediate needs, he was highly cooperative and effective. Once their usefulness ended, he abandoned them without any concern for the long-term damage he caused to their lives. A prime example of this selfish pattern occurred during his travels between 1559 and 1560. While visiting Scandinavia, he met Anna Thronson, the daughter of a wealthy Norwegian admiral. Bothwell entered into a formal betrothal with her, a practice known locally as a hand fasting. Under Scandinavian customs, this agreement carried strong legal weight and created a genuine expectation of marriage. During their engagement, Bothwell convinced Anna to finance his military and political ambitions. She sold off valuable assets tied to her dowry to provide him with necessary funds. After securing this money, Bothwell took her to Flanders and suddenly abandoned her there. She was left stranded in a foreign country, stripped of both her wealth and her promised social position. Historical legal documents clearly record this calculated and cruel betrayal. Bothwell used a personal relationship solely to extract financial support before discarding the woman involved. Although the broken engagement left him legally vulnerable in Scandinavia, he escaped safely back to his own territory. This transaction had absolutely no negative impact on his political or social standing in Scotland at the time. Bothwell applied this exact same strategy of exploitation when managing his political allies. He bought the loyalty of border families by providing them with opportunities for financial gain. If these followers became a burden, he easily broke his promises to seek better deals elsewhere. This ruthless flexibility allowed him to survive and maintain power within Scotland's highly unstable political landscape. By the early 1560s, the larger political setting in Scotland was shifting. Queen Mary returned from France in 1561. Her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in 1565 produced a son, James, in 1566. These events created new alignments and new tensions among the nobility. Bothwell positioned himself as a supporter of the Queen during the conflicts that followed the marriage. He brought his armed following to her side on several occasions. His reliability in supplying men and his readiness to use them made him a practical ally in a period when royal authority often depended on the cooperation of powerful nobles. Bothwell's offices and his border resources gave him independent weight. The Lord High Admiral title carried prestige and some maritime capability. The warden role gave him formal standing in the marches. In reality, his influence rested on the men he could command and on his demonstrated willingness to employ them. This combination allowed him to operate with considerable autonomy. It also reinforced the view, already formed in the borders, that direct action and control of force could override formal procedures when necessary. The early episode with Anna Thronson remained unresolved in legal terms. Because the betrothal and the financial arrangements had taken place in a Scandinavian jurisdiction, the claim was not extinguished by Bothwell's return to Scotland. At the time, he does not appear to have regarded the matter as a serious ongoing risk. His position in Scotland, backed by armed men and royal offices, provided protection. The distance between Scotland and Norway further reduced any immediate pressure. What the Anna episode illustrates is a repeatable method. Bothwell identified a source of needed resources, used personal engagement to secure them, and then ended the engagement once the resources were in hand. The method worked in the short term because he operated from a position of local strength, and because the other party lacked immediate means of enforcement. The same method, scaled up, would later be applied to larger objectives. The unresolved claim from 1559 to 1560 would eventually intersect with those larger events when Bothwell no longer held the protection of Scottish power. By the middle of the 1560s, Bothwell had therefore assembled the elements that would define his conduct in the decisive year of 1567. He possessed formal titles and offices. He commanded a body of armed followers habituated to border service. He had a record of using personal relationships and direct force to obtain what he required. He had formed a working view that political and legal obstacles could be managed or removed through the application of superior strength. He had also left behind at least one open legal claim that would become relevant once he lost the protection of his Scottish position. These elements did not yet point to a single fixed plan. They formed a set of capabilities and habits that Bothwell could apply when opportunity appeared. The opportunity that presented itself in 1567 concerned the position of Lord Darnley and the future of the Scottish crown. The steps Bothwell took in that year followed directly from the approach he had already practiced on a smaller scale in the borders and in his dealings with Anna Thronson. The outcome would test both the reach and the limits of that approach. By the beginning of 1567, the political situation in Scotland had reached a point of acute instability. Queen Mary had returned from France in 1561 and had since navigated a series of crises involving religion, noble factions, and her own marriage. Her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in July 1565, had initially appeared to strengthen her position by linking two claims to the throne. In practice, the marriage quickly produced new divisions. Darnley proved ambitious, erratic, and widely disliked among the nobility. He participated in the murder of the Queen's secretary, David Rizzio, in March 1566, and then distanced himself from many of the men who had acted with him. The birth of their son James in June 1566 did not resolve the tensions. By late 1566, Darnley was ill, reportedly suffering from symptoms consistent with advanced syphilis or a severe case of smallpox. He was recovering in a house at Kirklefield, a location just inside the walls of Edinburgh. James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, had aligned himself with the Queen during the conflicts that followed the Rizzio murder and the subsequent noble unrest. He had supplied armed men and had been rewarded with additional lands and influence. By early 1567, he held a clear objective: the removal of Darnley and the consolidation of his own position beside the Queen. The method he chose was not a private quarrel or a quiet elimination. It was a large-scale operation that required coordination, access to explosives, and the ability to control the aftermath. The operation centered on the house at Kirklefield. The house was a 2-story residence used for Darnley's convalescence. It stood in a relatively open area near the city wall. Bothwell's men identified the rooms directly beneath Darnley's chamber. Over a period of days, they moved approximately 14 large barrels of gunpowder into the lower level. The quantity was sufficient to destroy the structure completely when detonated. The placement turned the ground floor into a single large charge. The operation required secrecy, the movement of heavy barrels without drawing attention, and the cooperation of several trusted followers who understood the purpose. On the evening of February 9, 1567, Queen Mary visited her husband at Kirklefield. She had been attending him during his illness. Later that evening, she left to attend a wedding celebration for one of her servants at Holyrood Palace. She took her usual escort of guards with her. The departure left the house with reduced protection. Darnley remained inside with his valet and a small number of attendants. The timing of the Queen's departure removed the most visible royal presence from the scene. In the early hours of February 10th, shortly after 2 a.m., the fuse was lit. The explosion destroyed the 2-story building in a single detonation. Contemporary accounts describe a loud report and a flash that was visible across parts of Edinburgh. The force of the blast scattered masonry and timber over a wide area. When daylight came, searchers moved through the rubble. They found the bodies of Darnley and his valet not inside the destroyed house, but in the adjacent garden. The bodies showed no burns from the explosion and no wounds from flying debris or structural collapse. A chair, a length of rope, and a dagger lay nearby. The condition of the bodies indicated that Darnley and the valet had left the house before the detonation. The rope and chair suggest they had used a window to lower themselves or to escape. Once outside, they encountered a group positioned to intercept anyone who left the building. The absence of stab wounds or other blade injuries on the bodies points to manual strangulation as the cause of death. Strangulation left no obvious external marks that would immediately distinguish the deaths from injuries caused by the blast or by falling masonry. The placement of the bodies in the garden and the presence of the rope and chair formed the physical evidence that the explosion had been accompanied by a direct attack on the 2 men who had escaped it. The operation at Kirklefield followed the pattern Bothwell had used in smaller matters. He identified an objective, assembled the necessary resources, including explosives and men, and executed the action with speed. The explosion served as a visible and dramatic event that could be presented as an accident or as the work of unknown parties. The simultaneous removal of the 2 men outside the house ensured that Darnley did not survive to give any account. The choice of strangulation rather than blades reduced the immediate visual evidence of deliberate killing. The entire sequence required planning, access to gunpowder, and the ability to place men around the house without interference. In the days immediately after the explosion, suspicion focused on Bothwell. He had both the motive and the means. He had been building influence at court and had shown consistent willingness to use armed force. Public opinion in Edinburgh and among sections of the nobility turned against him quickly. Pamphlets and spoken reports accused him of arranging the death of the king consort. The queen herself faced questions about her departure from the house on the night of the explosion and about her prior knowledge of any danger. Bothwell did not respond to the accusations with a legal defense or with an offer of evidence. He continued to operate from a position of armed strength. His followers remained in Edinburgh and in the surrounding areas. The Scottish government, already weakened by years of factional conflict, found itself unable to conduct a normal investigation or to issue orders that would be enforced against Bothwell's men. The removal of Darnley had removed one center of opposition, but it had not produced stability. Instead, it had created a vacuum in which the next moves would be determined by whoever could bring the greater concentration of force to bear. The explosion and the deaths at Kirklefield marked the first large-scale application of Bothwell's established method. He had used explosives and direct violence to eliminate a political obstacle. The scale was greater than his earlier actions in the borders or his dealings with individuals, but the underlying approach remained the same. Identify the target, assemble overwhelming local advantage, execute the action, and manage the immediate consequences through presence rather than through legal argument. The success of the operation in removing Darnley was immediate. The longer-term consequences depended on how the nobility and the remaining institutions of government would respond once the initial shock passed. Contemporary records show that the investigation into the explosion was limited from the start. Witnesses were reluctant to speak. Physical evidence was collected, but not pursued through ordinary judicial channels. Bothwell's position as Lord High Admiral and as a border warden gave him practical immunity in the short term. He continued to attend court and to appear in public with his armed following. The Queen remained under pressure from multiple directions, from those who suspected her involvement, from those who demanded justice for Darnley, and from those who saw an opportunity to reduce royal authority. Bothwell's next actions followed directly from the removal of Darnley. With one obstacle cleared, he moved to neutralize the legal and political structures that could still obstruct him. He did not wait for formal charges to be prepared or for a regular trial process. Instead, he prepared to meet any summons with the same resource he had used at Kirklefield: armed men in sufficient numbers to overawe opposition. The period between mid-February and mid-April 1567 therefore became a contest between the remaining forms of Scottish legal authority and Bothwell's demonstrated capacity to bring superior force into Edinburgh. The events at Kirklefield also affected the Queen's position. Mary had been seen publicly with Darnley during his illness. Her departure on the night of the explosion left her open to accusations that she had known of or consented to the plan. Whether or not she had prior knowledge, the political effect was the same. She was now more isolated. The nobility that had already been divided over Darnley now faced a new situation in which the most powerful single figure with armed force was Bothwell. Many nobles who had opposed Darnley found themselves reluctant to accept Bothwell as the alternative. The result was a period of uneasy waiting while Bothwell consolidated the advantage he had created. The gunpowder plot itself required resources that were not available to ordinary individuals. Gunpowder in the quantities used had to be obtained, transported, and stored without detection. Bothwell's position as Lord High Admiral gave him access to military supplies. His control of armed followers gave him the labor and the secrecy needed to move the barrels into the house. The choice of Kirklefield, as the location, was practical. It was close enough to Edinburgh for rapid movement, yet sufficiently separate that the explosion could be attributed to unknown causes. The plan combined technical preparation with the psychological effect of a sudden, overwhelming blast. After the explosion, Bothwell maintained his public presence in Edinburgh. He did not go into hiding or attempt to distance himself from the scene. This visibility was consistent with his earlier practice of operating openly once an action had been completed. He appears to have calculated that any immediate challenge could be met with the same armed strength that had carried out the operation. The calculation held for several weeks. No force capable of arresting him or of conducting a full investigation appeared in the city. The deaths of Darnley and his valet removed the immediate focus of noble discontent. They did not, however, create a stable settlement. The Queen remained head of state, but without a consort who commanded broad support. Bothwell had removed one rival, but had not yet secured the formal position he sought. The next phase of his actions, therefore, turned from the elimination of Darnley to the management of the legal system and the nobility. He would apply the same principle of superior force to the institutions that could still challenge him. The weeks after February 10th, 1567 thus formed a bridge between the direct violence at Kirklefield and the subsequent efforts to convert that violence into lasting political control. Bothwell had shown that he could organize and execute a complex operation involving explosives and coordinated attack. He had also shown that he could remain in Edinburgh afterward without immediate arrest. The remaining question was whether the same approach would succeed when applied to courts, to formal bonds among nobles, and to the Queen herself. The answer would be tested in the months that followed. With Lord Darnley removed, Bothwell moved without delay to address the remaining obstacles that could still limit his position. The most immediate of these was the formal legal process that had begun to examine the events at Kirklefield. On April 12, 1567, Bothwell was summoned to appear at the toll booth in Edinburgh to answer charges connected with the death of the king consort. Rather than arrive with legal representatives or evidence, he entered the city at the head of approximately 4,000 armed men. These forces effectively placed the courthouse and the surrounding area under military control for the duration of the proceedings. The trial itself lasted roughly 7 hours. Prosecutors and witnesses operated under the visible presence of Bothwell's men. Several individuals who might have given testimony against him were either absent or declined to speak. The jury, drawn from men who understood the balance of armed force in the city, returned a verdict of not guilty. The outcome was recorded as a formal acquittal, but the process bore little resemblance to ordinary judicial procedure. Bothwell had substituted the presence of superior numbers for any substantive defense. The Scottish justice system, already weakened by prior conflicts, proved unable to function when confronted with this level of direct coercion. 1 week later, on April 19th, Bothwell took a further step to bind the nobility to his position. He invited a large group of the most powerful lords and bishops to a meeting at Ainsley's Tavern in Edinburgh. Once the guests were inside the building, Bothwell positioned approximately 200 of his musketeers around the exits. The men inside were effectively confined. Under these conditions, they were presented with a document known as the Ainsley Tavern Bond. The document declared Bothwell innocent of Darnley's death and stated that he was the most suitable husband for Queen Mary. The signatories included many of the leading figures in the kingdom. Their agreement was obtained while armed men controlled the only means of exit. The Ainsley Tavern Bond did not reflect voluntary consensus. It reflected the immediate reality that refusal carried personal risk, while the signatories remained inside the tavern. Bothwell had again used the direct application of armed force to override normal political deliberation. The document gave him a written instrument that could later be cited as evidence of noble support. In practice, it demonstrated how quickly formal agreements could be produced when one party controlled the physical space and the armed men inside it. With the legal acquittal secured and a document of noble acquiescence in hand, Bothwell turned to the final requirement for his objective: physical control of the Queen. On April 24th, 1567, Mary was traveling from Stirling back to Edinburgh. Her escort on this journey was light. Bothwell positioned a force of approximately 800 mounted men at the bridge at Fulbriggs. When the Queen's party reached the location, his men intercepted the column, disarmed the royal guards, and took Mary into custody. She was then conveyed to Dunbar Castle, a strongly fortified coastal stronghold under Bothwell's control. The removal of the Queen from her escort and her transfer to Dunbar completed the sequence of direct actions that had begun at Kirk-o-Field. Bothwell now held physical custody of the reigning monarch. Dunbar Castle's location and defenses made any immediate rescue attempt difficult. Inside the castle, Bothwell used the period of custody to press his demand for marriage. The pressure took both political and personal form. Mary was isolated from her normal council and from any independent armed support. The political argument presented to her was that her position as an unmarried queen who had been taken into custody left her with limited options for restoring stability. Contemporary accounts and later examinations of the period indicate that Bothwell also used direct physical coercion during the time at Dunbar. The assault on the Queen was not presented as an act of personal passion. It functioned as a calculated political instrument. In the diplomatic environment of 16th century Europe, a queen who had been subjected to sexual violence lost significant value as a potential marriage partner for foreign rulers. Bothwell understood this reality. By committing the assault, he deliberately reduced Mary's remaining diplomatic options. A defiled queen would find it nearly impossible to secure a new foreign alliance that could protect her throne. Marriage to the man who had taken her into custody became, under these conditions, the most immediate way to restore a public appearance of legitimacy and to protect the status of her crown. Bothwell moved immediately after the events at Dunbar to clear the remaining formal barrier to marriage, his existing marriage to Jean Gordon. He initiated proceedings for annulment through both Protestant and Catholic channels. The process was completed in less than a week. The speed was possible because Bothwell controlled the necessary political leverage in Scotland and because the grounds cited, primarily consanguinity, could be processed rapidly when no effective opposition existed. With the annulment in place, Bothwell received the title Duke of Orkney on May 15, 1567. On the same day, he and Mary were married in a ceremony at Holyrood. The marriage took place under conditions of clear coercion. Foreign ambassadors resident in Edinburgh refused to attend. Their absence reflected the widespread view among outside observers that the union had been produced by kidnapping and force, rather than by any normal process of royal consent. The boycott was unanimous among the diplomatic community. It signaled that the new arrangement carried no international recognition and that the methods used to create it had destroyed any remaining claim to legitimacy in the eyes of other courts. Bothwell had now achieved the position he had set as his objective at the beginning of 1567. He had removed Darnley through direct action, neutralized the initial legal response through armed presence at the toll booth, secured a document of noble agreement through confinement at Ainsley's Tavern, taken physical custody of the Queen, and converted that custody into a formal marriage. Each step relied on the same underlying resource: the ability to bring superior armed force to the precise location where a decision was required. The method had produced rapid results. It had also created a new set of conditions that would soon test its sustainability. The speed of the sequence from April to mid-May left little time for organized opposition to form. Many nobles who had signed the Ainsley Tavern bond later stated that they had done so under immediate threat. Others who had remained outside the tavern watched the rapid consolidation of Bothwell's position with growing concern. The forced nature of the marriage, combined with the visible use of armed men at every stage, produced a reaction that went beyond the earlier divisions over Darnley. What had been scattered suspicion after Kirklefield began to consolidate into coordinated resistance. Bothwell appears to have believed that the combination of legal acquittal, noble bond, and royal marriage would stabilize his position. The reality was different. The same actions that had cleared his path had also removed the remaining restraints on noble action against him. Nobles who had previously been divided now found a common reason to oppose the new arrangement. The Queen herself, now married under duress, retained formal authority but had lost the independent capacity to restrain Bothwell or to seek external support. The period of Bothwell's maximum control, therefore, proved brief. Within weeks, the forces that had been held in check by his armed presence began to organize outside Edinburgh. The events between April 12th and May 15th, 1567, demonstrated both the reach and the internal weakness of Bothwell's approach. He had shown that he could override courts, confine nobles, seize the monarch, and convert physical custody into a formal title and marriage. He had done so on a compressed timeline and with consistent reliance on armed men rather than on negotiation or legal process. The method worked because it concentrated force at each decision point faster than opposition could mobilize. Its limitation was that it created unified resistance once the immediate shock had passed. The nobles who had been compelled to sign documents or who had witnessed the abduction now had a shared interest in reversing the outcome. That interest would soon produce a military response. Bothwell's position after the marriage therefore rested entirely on continued control of armed force and on the Queen's formal acceptance of the Union. Neither element proved durable once organized opposition appeared. The next phase of events would move from the closed spaces of the toll booth, Ainsley's Tavern, and Dunbar Castle to an open confrontation on a battlefield where numerical advantage and morale would be tested directly. The forced marriage of May 15, 1567 did not produce stability. Instead, it accelerated the consolidation of opposition among the Scottish nobility. Many lords who had signed the Ainsley Tavern bond under direct pressure later withdrew their support. Others who had remained outside the tavern, viewed the sequence of events at Kirko Field, the toll booth, Ainsley's Tavern, and Dunbar Castle as a single pattern of coercion that threatened the remaining structure of noble authority. The result was the formation of a coalition known as the Confederate Lords. This group raised armed forces with the explicit purpose of removing Bothwell from power and restoring order under their own control. The confrontation occurred on June 15th, 1567 at Carberry Hill near Musselburgh. Bothwell commanded a force that included his border followers and additional levies. The Confederate lords brought a larger army and a clear psychological advantage. They marched under a large banner that displayed the body of Lord Darnley lying beneath a tree, with the infant Prince James shown praying for vengeance. The image was carried openly at the front of their lines. When Bothwell's men saw the banner, many recognized the direct connection being drawn between the events at Kirko Field and the man now commanding them. Desertions began almost immediately. Soldiers who had been willing to fight for pay or for local advantage were not prepared to stand against a force that presented itself as seeking justice for the murdered king consort. The day was hot. As the sun rose higher, more of Bothwell's men left their positions and moved into the surrounding hills. Bothwell attempted to halt the collapse by riding forward and issuing a public challenge to single combat. He declared that he would fight any leader of the opposing army to decide the outcome. Several commanders stepped forward. Bothwell refused to engage those whose rank he declared too low for a Duke of Orkney. He continued to stall while his army continued to melt away. Eventually, Lord Lindsay, an earl of equal formal rank and a man known for physical toughness, accepted the challenge. Lindsay removed his armor to show that he was prepared for a fight to the death on equal terms. Faced with an opponent who could actually kill him, Bothwell withdrew from the challenge. He refused to fight. The refusal occurred in full view of both armies. Mary, who was present with Bothwell's forces, intervened to prevent the duel from proceeding. Her intervention saved Bothwell from immediate combat, but also made visible the limits of his position. The Confederate lords then offered terms. Mary could surrender to them, and Bothwell would be permitted to leave the field alive. This was the decisive moment. Bothwell had the option to remain with the queen he had married under force and to face the consequences alongside her. He chose instead to accept the offer of safe passage. He kissed Mary's hand, mounted his horse, and rode away at speed. He left her standing on the field with a reduced and increasingly hostile force. The soldiers who remained began to direct open hostility toward her, calling for her to be treated as responsible for Darnley's death. Bothwell's departure removed the only armed protection she still possessed at that location. Within hours, she was in the custody of the Confederate lords. The flight directly contributed to her later forced abdication and to her eventual imprisonment in England. Bothwell was now the most wanted man in Scotland. The Confederate lords had recovered a silver casket containing letters and documents that appeared to implicate him directly in the planning of Darnley's death. A substantial bounty was placed on his capture. He fled northward to the Orkney and Shetland Islands, areas where he held nominal title as Duke of Orkney. Local authorities there refused him sanctuary. Stripped of effective protection, he turned to the only remaining means of survival available to a former admiral with ships and men. He began raiding merchant vessels in the North Sea. In August 1567, a Scottish naval force under the command of William Kirkcaldy of Grange located Bothwell's ships at Bressay Sound in Shetland. A chase developed. Bothwell used his knowledge of the local waters to steer his vessel through a narrow and dangerous reef passage. His ship scraped through. The pursuing vessels struck the rocks and were damaged. He escaped immediate capture by the Scottish squadron. The escape was temporary. A violent storm swept across the North Sea and drove his remaining ships far off their intended course. They were carried into Norwegian territorial waters. In early September 1567, the ships reached the coast near Karmøy in Norway. A Danish naval patrol under Christian Aalborg intercepted them. The crews were questioned. They carried no valid passports or letters of transit and showed clear signs of having been engaged in piracy. Aalborg arrested the men and took Bothwell to Bergenhus Castle for interrogation by the regional governor, Eric Rosenkrantz. Bothwell presented himself as the Duke of Orkney and husband of the Queen of Scotland. He demanded treatment appropriate to his claimed rank. The claim had no effect in Norwegian jurisdiction. While Bothwell was held at Bergenhus, news of the arrest spread among the local elite. Anna Thronson, the woman Bothwell had betrothed and then abandoned in 1559 to 1560 after taking her dairy assets, learned of his presence. She entered the fortress and filed a formal legal complaint. In the Norwegian court, Bothwell's Scottish titles carried no weight. The court examined the earlier handfasting agreement and the financial transactions that had followed it. Judgment was given in Anna's favor. Bothwell was ordered to surrender his remaining ships, his available funds, and other assets as compensation. Once these had been transferred, he was placed in chains and sent to Copenhagen to face the judgment of King Frederick II of Denmark. Frederick II initially treated Bothwell as a potentially useful political asset, rather than as a criminal to be executed. He held him in relatively comfortable house arrest at Malmö Castle from 1568 to 1573. The Danish king hoped to use the Scottish noble as leverage in negotiations over the Orkney and Shetland Islands, which Denmark still regarded as historically subject to its claims. For several years, Bothwell remained in this status, a prisoner with nominal comforts retained because he might one day be exchanged or used to extract territorial concessions. During these years, the situation in Scotland continued to move against Bothwell's remaining interests. Mary's supporters were systematically removed from power. She herself was held in England with no prospect of return. Bothwell's value as a bargaining chip declined steadily. He was no longer connected to any active political force that could influence events in Scotland or England. What had begun as a period of guarded detention gradually became an expensive and unnecessary burden on the Danish crown. By 1573, Frederick II had lost patience with the arrangement. Bothwell was stripped of any remaining noble status recognized by Denmark. He was transferred from Malmö Castle to the more remote Dragsholm Castle. There, he was placed in the deepest dungeon the fortress possessed. The transfer marked the end of any political utility and the beginning of a period of deliberate isolation and physical restriction that would last until his death. The events from Carberry Hill to the arrival in Danish custody showed the rapid reversal that followed Bothwell's period of maximum control. The same reliance on armed force that had allowed him to override courts and seize the Queen proved insufficient once organized opposition formed, and once he no longer held the Queen as a shield. His flight from Carberry Hill preserved his immediate safety, but removed any remaining claim to legitimacy. The turn to piracy exposed him to capture outside Scottish jurisdiction. The reappearance of Anna Thronson in Norway demonstrated that earlier actions left unresolved could return with full legal force when he no longer commanded local power. The initial Danish detention preserved his life but tied his fate to the shifting calculations of a foreign monarch who had no permanent interest in his survival. By the time Bothwell entered the dungeon at Dragsholm, the pattern that had defined his career had reached its limit. He had used direct force and the exploitation of individuals to reach the highest position available in Scotland. When that force was matched and then exceeded by organized opposition, the structure he had built collapsed. The remaining years would be determined not by his own actions, but by the decisions of his captors and by the physical conditions they imposed. In June 1573, King Frederick II of Denmark ended the period of house arrest at Malmö Castle. Bothwell was stripped of any remaining formal status and transferred to Dragsholm Castle, a remote fortress on the Danish island of Zealand. There he was placed in the lowest subterranean dungeon. The chamber was a stone vault below ground level that received constant seepage of groundwater. The only restraint was an iron chain fixed to a central pillar. The chain had been forged to a length that allowed movement only within a restricted radius. Bothwell could not stand upright. For the remaining years of his life, he was compelled to remain in a permanent crouch, hunch, or crawl on the wet stone floor. The physical effects accumulated over 5 years. The unnatural posture placed continuous strain on the spine. Vertebrae compressed and the natural curve of the back deformed. Joints stiffened and deteriorated. Movement became increasingly limited and painful. Without any means of standing or stretching, the body adapted to the confined space by locking into the hunched position. By the later years, Bothwell could no longer straighten, even when the chain permitted limited motion. Sanitary conditions were absent. There were no facilities for waste. Bothwell lived, ate, and slept in the accumulating filth of his own excrement and urine. The enclosed space had no ventilation. Ammonia from the waste rose into the air and irritated the eyes and respiratory passages continuously. Rats and lice infested the chamber and fed on his body. The only food provided was water and bread that had become moldy and rotten. The diet contained no vitamin C. Scurvy developed and progressed without treatment. Gums swelled and bled. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old injuries reopened. Skin broke down into ulcers that did not heal. The combination of constant damp, restricted movement, poor nutrition, and infection produced a steady physical decline. The psychological effects followed from the same conditions. Bothwell was held in complete isolation. No human contact was permitted. Light was absent or minimal. Sound from above reached him only as distant and indistinct noise. Over months and then years, the mind that had previously directed coordinated actions lost its structure. He ceased to produce recognizable speech. Guards on the levels above reported hearing only prolonged, animal-like howling and guttural sounds rising from the dungeon. In the final period, he attacked the stone walls with his hands. Fingernails were torn away, and the fingers became damaged from repeated contact with the rock. Bothwell died in April 1578, at approximately 44 years old, his immediate cause of death recorded as heart failure. He was found entirely alone in the dungeon, still locked in his restricted posture, surrounded by the accumulated waste of his confinement without having received any medical attention in his final stages. After death, the body was removed from the filth and placed in a wooden container within the crypt of Foravile Church. This crypt possessed a highly specific microclimate, featuring consistently low temperatures, very low humidity, and surrounding soil with a high nitrate content. These exact conditions prevented normal bacterial decomposition, rapidly drawing moisture from the tissues. His skin dried and contracted, forming a tough leathery layer that adhered tightly to his skeleton, resulting in natural mummification without any artificial preservation. Furthermore, because no one had closed his eyes or secured his jaw at the moment of death, the severe drying process permanently fixed his facial muscles into a wide, open-mouthed expression of agony. These mummified remains soon became known as the screaming mummy, with the grotesquely hunched posture of his deformed spine remaining clearly visible through the preserved tissues. In the 19th century, the crypt was opened, and Danish authorities removed the mummified body to place it on public display inside a red, velvet-lined glass case in the nave of Foreville Church. For more than a century, the remains drew countless tourists, particularly British travelers deeply familiar with the dark Scottish history connected to the body. Many came specifically to view the preserved, wretched form of the man who had once forcefully married Mary, Queen of Scots. Instead of historical reverence, some directed open mockery at the macabre display. It became a common grim tradition for visitors to point at his deformed spine, mock his fixed facial expression, and literally spit on the glass directly above his head. This bizarre public exhibition continued uninterrupted until 1976. By that time, as international standards regarding the treatment of human remains evolved, mounting pressure from historians, ethical organizations, and formal requests from living descendants of the Hepburn family finally reached the highest levels of the Danish government. Queen Margrethe II directly ordered the glass case to be permanently removed. The mummified body was placed in a solid wooden coffin and buried beneath the floor of the church, officially ending a 400-year cycle of public humiliation and display. The complete record of James Hepburn's life shows a consistent method applied across different scales. He identified objectives that required the removal or control of other people. He assembled the resources of armed men, explosives, or personal pressure needed to achieve each objective. He executed the actions directly and then used the resulting position to press for the next gain. The method produced rapid advancement when local superiority of force could be maintained. It produced equally rapid reversal when that superiority was lost. At Carberry Hill, the same reliance on armed followers encountered an opposing force that matched and then exceeded it. Desertion occurred because the men serving him saw no continuing advantage in remaining. The challenge to single combat exposed the boundary of his willingness to accept personal risk. When an opponent of equal standing accepted, he withdrew. The subsequent flight preserved his own safety for a time, but removed any remaining basis for claiming legitimate authority. The queen he had taken into custody was left without protection. Her later fate followed directly from that moment. The turn to piracy after the flight placed him outside any protective jurisdiction. Capture in Norwegian waters returned him to a legal system where earlier actions could be examined without the shield of Scottish power. The reappearance of Anna Thronsen in Norway converted a private transaction from 1559 to 1560 into a formal judgment that stripped him of his remaining assets. Danish detention initially treated him as a diplomatic token connected to the Orkney and Shetland Islands. When that token lost value after the destruction of Mary's remaining support in Scotland, the token was discarded into permanent isolation. The final years in the dungeon at Dragsholm removed every remaining capacity for action. The physical restrictions and the absence of human contact produced a progressive breakdown of both body and mind. Death occurred without witness or ceremony. The subsequent preservation of the body was an unintended result of the crypt's natural conditions, rather than any deliberate plan. The long period of public display turned the remains into an object that could be viewed and commented upon by strangers. The eventual reburial ended the display but did not restore any prior status. Throughout the sequence, Bothwell operated on the assumption that superior local force could override institutions, agreements, and personal consequences. The record shows that this assumption held only while the force remained unmatched. When it was matched, the structure collapsed. The earlier pattern of extracting resources from individuals and then discarding them reappeared in the form of Anathronson's claim once he no longer controlled the territory in which the claim could be ignored. The final physical and mental deterioration occurred because no external force any longer had reason to preserve him. The life, therefore, contains no element of sustained success or of tragic reversal imposed by external fate alone. It shows a sequence in which each gain was produced by direct coercion, and each loss followed when that coercion could no longer be maintained. The outcome in the dungeon and the subsequent treatment of the remains stand as the extended result of the same pattern once all protective power had been removed. The institutions and individuals he had overridden or discarded were no longer available to intervene on his behalf. What remained was the bare application of custody without any further political purpose.